record. Hello, my name is Fred Anami, and in this presentation I will evaluate the ethical issue of submitting an assignment written by artificial intelligence using Immanuel Kant's deontological ethical theory. Artificial intelligence tools are becoming increasingly common in education. While these tools can help students learn, there is an important ethical question. When students submit work generated entirely by AI and present it as their own. To analyze this issue, I will apply Kant's categorical imperative focus on its three formulations: the universal law formulation, the humanity formulation, and the kingdom of ends formulation. Through this, we can determine whether submitting AI-generated assignment as one's own work is morally acceptable according to Kantian ethics. The presentation will follow 5 main steps. First, we'll explain the concept of deontology, which is the ethical theory associated with the Immanuel Kant. Then we will introduce Kant's categorical imperative, which serves as the central principle in his moral philosophy. Third, I will describe the scenario that we are analyzing, which involves submitting an assignment written by artificial intelligence as one's own work. I will also apply each of the three formulations of the categorical imperative in this scenario. And finally, I will summarize ethical implications of the analysis and explain why Kant's theory suggests about academic integrity and responsible use of AI in academic situation. Deontology is the moral theory that evaluates action on whether they follow moral duties and rules rather than focusing on consequence of the action. The term deontology comes from a Greek word deon, which means duty. According to this theory, certain actions are morally right or wrong regardless of the results they produce. For example, telling the truth is considered morally required even if your lying might produce better consequences. The philosopher closely associated with deontology is Immanuel Kant. Kant believed that morality is based on rational principles that apply universally to all people. This means that moral rules should depend on personal preference or outcomes but should apply equally to everyone. Kant proposed the categorical imperative as a fundamental principle of morality. Unlike hypothetical rules, which depend on person's goal or desires, the categorical imperative applies universally to all rational individuals regardless of the circumstances. Provides tests that help determine whether an action is morally acceptable. Kant expressed the categorical imperative in several different formulations. Although they are worded differently, they all express the same underlying moral principle. The three most commonly formulations are formula of universal law, the formula of humanity as an end, and the kingdom of end formulation. Each of these provides different perspective in evaluating whether an action is morally right or wrong. The scenario I will analyze involves students submitting an assignment written entirely by artificial intelligence and presenting it as their own work. The situation has become increasingly relevant as AI writing tools have become more accessible. Many universities and educational institutions consider this behavior a form of academic dishonesty because the student is claiming credit for work they did not personally complete. It raises an important ethical question about honesty, fairness, and responsibility in education. Using Kant's framework, we can analyze whether this action represents moral duties and universal principles. Universal law. The first formulation of the Kant's categorical imperative is known as the formula of universal law. He states that why we should act only according to the maximum that we could reasonably want to become a universal law. A maxim is essentially the rule or principle behind our action. To apply this test, we ask ourselves a simple question: what should happen if everyone acted according to the same rule? If universalizing the rule leads to contradiction or makes the action impossible to carry out, then the action is considered morally wrong. The test helps us determine whether an action can be morally justified for everyone, not just for an individual. Now, the universal law formulation to the scenario of submitting an AI assignment as one's own work. The maxim behind this action could be stated as students may submit AI-generated assignment and claim them as their own work. If we imagine a world where students followed this rule, academic assignments will lose their meaning. Assignments are designed to evaluate students' knowledge, understanding, and effort. If all students relied on AI instead of doing their own work, educators will no longer be able to assess learning accurately. As a result, the purpose of assignments would collapse. This creates a contradiction between the system of education depends on students completing their own work. Therefore, according to the universal law test, this action is morally impermissible. The second formulation of the categorical imperative is the formula of humanity as an end. Kant argues that we should always treat humanity, whether in ourselves or in others, as an end in itself and never merely as a means. This means we must respect dignity, autonomy, and rationality of other individuals. Using someone as a means involved manipulating or deceiving them for personal benefit. Kant believes that moral action must respect the inherent value of every person. Therefore, when evaluating an action, we must consider whether it respects the rights and dignity of others. Kant proposed the categorical imperative as a fundamental principle of morality. Unlike hypothetical rules, which depend on person's goal or desires, the categorical imperative applies universally to all rational individuals regardless of the circumstances. Provides tests that help determine whether an action is morally acceptable. Kant expressed the categorical imperative in several different formulations. Although they are worded differently, they all express the same underlying moral principle. The three most commonly formulations are formula of universal law, the formula of humanity as an end, and the kingdom of end formulation. Each of these provides different perspective in evaluating whether an action is morally right or wrong. The third formulation of Kant's categorical imperative is known as the kingdom of ends. In this formulation, Kant asks us to imagine moral community in which all individuals act according to the universal moral rules. This ideal society, people both create and follow ethical principles while respecting the dignity of others. Every person acts as a rational member of a moral community. The goal is to create a system where rule promotes fairness, honesty, and mutual respect. This formulation encourages us to think about how actions affect the moral structure of the society. If we apply the kingdom ends of the concept into education, we imagine an academic community based on honesty, fairness, and integrity. In such community, students will complete their assignment honestly and take responsibility for their learning. Submitting AI-generated work as one's own would undermine this shared moral value. It would damage trust between students and educators and weaken the integrity of the academic system. Because this behavior conflicts with the principle of fairness, honesty, that supports a moral academic community would not be accepted in a kingdom of ends. Therefore, Kant's third formulation also indicates that this action is morally wrong. Imperative is known as the formula of universal law. He states that why we should act only according to the maximum that we could reasonably want to become a universal law. A maxim is essentially the rule or principle behind our action. To apply this test, we ask ourselves a simple question: what should happen if everyone acted according to the same rule? If universalizing the rule leads to contradiction or makes the action impossible to carry out, then the action is considered morally wrong. The test helps us determine whether an action can be morally justified for everyone, not just for an individual. The ethical analysis highlights the importance of academic integrity in modern education. AI tools can be useful when they are used responsibly, such as assisting with research, brainstorming ideas, or improving writing skills. However, the students still have the moral duty to produce their own work and demonstrate their learning honesty. The ethical framework reminds us that most moral actions should respect the universal principles and the dignity of others. By following these principles, students contribute to a fair, trustworthy academic environment. In conclusion, Kant's demographic ethics provide a powerful framework for evaluating moral action. The categorical imperative asks us to consider whether our actions could be law, whether they respect the dignity of others, and whether they support moral community. When we apply these principles to the issue of submitting AI-generated assignment as one's own work, the conclusion is clear. Such behavior violates universal principles, deceives others, and undermines academic integrity. Therefore, from the Cartesian perspective, students have a moral duty to complete their assignments honestly. The ideas discussed in this presentation are based primarily on Immanuel Kant's work, Groundwork of the Mythical Metaphysics of Morals, and the additional explanation of Kant's ethical theory can be found in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which provides a detailed overview of Kant's moral philosophy. The source helps us explain the meaning and application of the categorical imperative and its relevance to contemporary ethical issues such as the use of artificial intelligence in education.